In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the ventilation system. Um, it's what I'm calling the ventilation system, but you might know it as the respiratory system. And really the way that we move important gases in and out of our body. So, just to continue in with the example that we were talking about in the previous video, I'm going to write out the equation for cellular respiration. So just to give you something to anchor this content on, we talked about in the previous video about glucose getting into your body through your digestive system and then finding its way into the circulatory system by crossing the villi and then into the capillary beds in the villi and then moving around to every single cell in the body. Glucose is one of those nutrients that enters your body in that way. We've also got oxygen, and I guess I'll write it as O2. It's oxygen gas in this form. It's not just any form of oxygen. Giving off carbon dioxide plus water plus ATP, which is usable energy for our body as well as all the other living forms of life. And it stands for adenosine triphosphate. So this is one place where we find phosphorus, and we'll learn more about that when we talk about this equation more specifically with a little bit more detail. But what we're really trying to do here is follow oxygen and how oxygen gets into our body for a specific type of cellular respiration known as aerobic respiration. And this type of cellular respiration gives us lots and lots of ATP. So when we have oxygen, we can do aerobic respiration. So we need to talk a little bit about how that gets in. Now, some students might confuse oxygen as a nutrient, but remember the definition of a nutrient is a chemical that is found in food and used by the body. Oxygen gas is not found in food and therefore is not a nutrient, but we do need to breathe that in. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens through this process of supposed to be an L, ventilation. There's several parts to this that you need to understand, and the first is that let me do this in a different color pen. We do this first by inhaling air from the environment, and we're hoping that that air has higher oxygen levels than CO2 levels. When there's more oxygen in the air, that's a good thing. There's more oxygen than carbon dioxide. Actually, let me restate that. We're going to scratch that out. We're going to clarify that in a little bit more detail. So we inhale hoping to get oxygen into our body, and that oxygen finds its way into our lungs, into these structures that kind of look like grapes on a stalk, or grapes on a stalk. They're called alveoli. So they find their way to the alveoli, or alveolus, singular, but the alveoli of the lungs. So they go in your mouth or in your nasal cavity. That air goes in. It goes down your trachea, down your bronchus, or bronchi, left and right bronchi, and then into bronchioles, which end with these alveoli. There's a pretty good diagram on page, 183 of your textbook of these parts, and so I encourage you to look at that so you understand what I'm talking about. But this gas finds its way to the alveoli of your lungs, which is where oxygen diffuses into the capillaries that line the alveoli. So they simply diffuse. So I guess we should take a moment to define what diffuse means, or what diffusion is. And diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high concentration. This is my abbreviation. You need to write out high concentration to low concentration. So what we're hoping really, and what I scratched this out because we're really hoping that there's more oxygen in the atmosphere or in the air than there is in the blood, so that the oxygen will diffuse from where there's high oxygen to where there's low oxygen in the blood. And then what happens is that the blood, which is now heavily oxygenated from the lungs, goes back to the heart through the pulmonary vein. So look at your previous notes. Goes back to the heart through the pulmonary vein, finds its way to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, goes around the body, some of it going, all of it going through the aorta, but some of it rerouting back to through the coronary to the heart, otherwise going to the head or to the rest of the body, where again the oxygen moves from the blood, diffuses from the blood into the cells of your body. So from where there's high oxygen concentration to low oxygen concentration, and finds its way to the mitochondria, where it's used for aerobic cellular respiration. And that aerobic cellular respiration is this equation right here. So really what we need to know is that this process then makes, as a byproduct of this process, making lots of ATP, which is what we're using it for, but it makes carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is toxic to us. Remember that when carbon dioxide builds up, because you're not breathing fast enough, the medulla oblongata in your brain senses this, sends a signal to your SA node in your heart through the cardiac nerve to speed up the heart rate so that you can exchange this oxygen carbon dioxide and really get rid of the carbon dioxide back at the lungs, at the alveoli, to control those levels of carbon dioxide. And once it's under control, then the vagus nerve is sent back to the SA nerve from the medulla oblongata to slow down the heartbeat. But anyways, that CO2 is now traveling through your blood. It's bound to hemoglobin, which is what this oxygen was bound to. Remember, it's got iron in it. Iron and oxygen are attracted to each other. And so the CO2 takes the place of where the oxygen was, and it's carried back to the alveoli. So that CO2 was bound to the hemoglobin as it passed back to the heart, to the right atrium and the right ventricle, through the pulmonary artery, back to the alveoli of the lungs. It diffuses out to the atmosphere. That means that we should have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood than we do in the environment, so that the carbon dioxide diffuses out, and then we exhale that carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And that's really the long-term process. So this cycle is happening over and over and over again. So I think that that's kind of an interesting story and a good connection back to the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system. So you need to know how this oxygen and carbon dioxide work there. You need to know how heart rate is controlled due to carbon dioxide levels, based on the medulla oblongata and the cardiac and vagus nerves. But really the next big question that I hope you're asking is, why do we need this system? Why is this system so complicated? So why do we need a ventilation system? Why do we need something so complicated? And there are two major reasons. And one is that we have cells that don't have direct access to the environment. So that means that not all of our cells are touching the atmosphere so that oxygen and carbon dioxide can't freely diffuse in and out of every single cell. So we have to have a combo of the respiratory system and the circulatory system to maintain the right level of these gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide for our system. The second reason is that we need a concentration gradient. We need a concentration gradient to allow diffusion to happen. And I guess I should say, if we go back to the definition of diffusion, that this is a passive transport. This requires no additional energy directly for diffusion to happen. Although it does take energy for us to breathe in and out, to inhale and exhale. So why don't we talk very, very quickly about how that happens. I'm going to just draw out a box here. So how does ventilation happen? So your lungs are simply like bags that fill with air or have air pushed out of them. And so really there's a muscle, and I'm sure you've heard of this, called the diaphragm. The diaphragm. If you're an athlete or a singer or a musician, I'm sure you've heard of this. When you control your diaphragm, you're controlling your breathing. But your diaphragm is this muscle that sits underneath your lungs. And when it normally sits in a curved arch like this, so when it's contracted or when you're flexing this muscle comes down and lays much more flat. And what that does, if you're thinking about your chest cavity, the space in your chest, what that does is increases the volume. When it comes down like that, this increases the volume. And by doing so, because the air molecules that were in your chest cavity have more space, this decreases the pressure. And when there's less pressure inside your chest cavity than in the atmosphere, air rushes in. And that's when you inhale. So try this right now. Practice inhaling. And if you breathe in, you'll feel that your chest is getting bigger. You're increasing the volume in your chest as air is flowing in. But it's not just the diaphragm that does that. We also have muscles called the intercostal muscles. And you sometimes will feel these strain when you're running and you're breathing really heavy and you feel that sharp pain in your ribs. These intercostal muscles are in your ribs, and they're also helping to increase your chest cavity in volume. So when you breathe in, you'll feel your ribs stretch out, and then when you breathe out, your ribs are being forced in, and your diaphragm goes up. So if your diaphragm's is low when you have a full breath in, and you are breathing out, your diaphragm goes up, your intercostal muscles in your ribs come down, and what it does is lowers the volume and increases the pressure, so air is essentially pushed out of your lungs as you exhale. And remember, when you're breathing in, you're hoping that there's more oxygen in the air that you breathe than in your blood, and vice versa for the carbon dioxide, because you're hoping to get rid of that carbon dioxide so that it will diffuse from the capillaries around your alveoli into these bags that we call your lungs, and then you breathe them out through your mouth and nose. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. There are a few other little details that you need to know about the respiratory system, but let's not worry about them yet for the podcast, or for the preparatory check. Instead, make sure you understand these big ideas, and we'll talk about some of the details in class. Okay?